London, and the Mother of Parliaments begins its new year with pomp and majesty.
My lords, pray be seated.
This ceremonial opening of Parliament was mainly devised in the Victorian age, but it is redolent of a feudal age.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this honourable House to attend Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
Located around Westminster, the statues of national figures dating back to the Celtic Queen Boudica. War leader Winston Churchill, one-time supporter of the abolition of the House of Lords. And the great medieval hero, Richard the Lionheart, the very embodiment of the English hero figure. Champion of Christ, a friend of Robin Hood and the poor. In reality, he saw England only as a source of cash for his foolhardy exploits. King of England for 10 years, he spent less than 6 months there. He could not even speak its language. Myth has always been a potent force in a nation's history, whatever nation that may be. History is bent and shaped to comply with the needs of the nation. Truth and history rarely rhyme. Nations, after all, are made by men. And they can be destroyed by men. England was close to ruin. Once Henry I's only male heir had been drowned at sea, the country faced the same old problem of succession. Now the heir apparent was Henry's daughter, Matilda. England had never been ruled by a queen. So her throne was hijacked by her cousin Stephen, grandson of the Conqueror. The country was immediately plunged into the most bitter civil war between those who accepted Matilda's rights of birth and those who would never accept a female ruler. The War of Succession had tragic consequences. Throughout England, the armies bled the countryside of food and were ruthless in the treatment of their enemies. It is unknown how many were killed in the various skirmishes and pitched battles that raged through the country. In every county, bodies of warring factions littered the fields. As usual, it was the poor who suffered most. Hard on the heels of warfare came famine and the deadly plague. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle relates that you could go a whole day's journey and not find a village with anyone living in it. The land was ruined, and it was openly said that Christ and his saints were asleep. England desperately needed a strong king, and got one, courtesy of a particular marriage. Henry I had given his daughter's hand to the Count of Anjou, nicknamed Plantagenet, because he wore a sprig of yellow broom, Planta Genesta, in his hat. Matilda brought to the wedding her claim to the English crown. The marriage was blessed by a son, Henry. He would become one of England's greatest kings. Aged 17, his father bequeathed him the title of Duke of Normandy. A year later, his father died, and Henry was able to adopt his title Count of Anjou and inherit Brittany, which his father had conquered for him. What he now needed was a wife, preferably one with property. That's when Eleanor of Aquitaine caught his eye. One of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, she was also a graceful, dark-eyed beauty. Her court was the talk of France, her sexual exploits the source of endless rumors. Although 11 years older than him, the age difference meant nothing to the love-struck Henry. But she could not be his, not yet at least. Eleanor was already married, and married at that to the King of France. Her husband, however, would have been better suited to the life of a monk than the husband of one of Europe's raving beauties. It came to something when his Holy Father, the Pope, commanded the king to sleep with his wife. Many would not have needed the slightest encouragement. Worse was to follow for Eleanor when she was yanked out of her comfortable and enjoyable life. She now had to accompany her husband on a crusade to the Holy Land. She was not an irreligious woman, and the hunky, macho Norman knights on board ship held plenty of attractions, or so it was said. This was not Eleanor's lifestyle, and it was obvious to everyone that the marriage was all but over. The divorce soon followed, and she quickly refocused from being the ex-Queen of France to, perhaps, the future Queen of England. Today, she lies buried next to her husband. The marriage, on all counts, pleased Henry no end.
This made him, in terms of money and men, courtly magnificence, a far grander figure than the King of France. The King of France can't have been too happy about that. Above all, because Eleanor had been his wife before they had separated, and lo and behold, this Henry, this young Henry, had snapped her up. What could be more irritating for a man to find himself outshone by the second husband of his discarded wife?
In all this, Henry had never forgotten that his mother had been discarded. Robbed of the throne of England, Henry set his mind on recapturing it. The now aging Stephen, with no heirs of his own, made one last request: to be allowed to die on the throne. Henry did not have long to wait. Within the year, Stephen was dead. So on the 19th of December, 1154, here in Westminster Abbey, Henry and Eleanor were crowned King and Queen of England. The empire they in time came to rule stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. The lands of the King of France paled into insignificance. With so many estates, how much of a Norman was Henry?
But Normandy was the place where he spent most time. It was so central, halfway, as it were, between England and Aquitaine. So I guess he felt pretty Norman. Indeed, we know that he commissioned a kind of history of his ancestors as Dukes of Normandy and he looked at their tombs and rearranged their tombs. So I think he felt pretty Norman.
By maintaining the French connection, Henry anchored all his English subjects in the French orbit. The nobility drank wine, not cheap beer, at table. And that table was made up luxuriously with French food, cooked in the French way, and served with French manners. The French ruling class treated the culture of England with imperial disdain, and nowhere was this made more apparent than in the language of eating.
French came at them from all directions. To take the simplest thing, food. The English word was pig, which the English people raised, but the French called it pork, which they ate. The English word was cow, which English peasants tended. Peasant is also a French word. The French ate beef, boeuf, their word. The English word was lamb, and the French word was mutton, mouton. And so it went on. A very simple example of the way, as it were, the English laboured and the French feasted.
The French also jousted, held tournaments of unbelievable splendour. This was the age of chivalry. As with everything else associated with the culture of French aristocracy, it was imported and implanted in the estates of England. So too were the troubadours with the verses of courtly love. And then they stole again. Not the land this time, but the myths of their Celtic neighbours. A Celtic warrior and his followers from the Dark Ages were given a Norman makeover. The Age of Arthur was born. But there was a snag in the makeover. The Celtic Arthur had never died. He lay sleeping, waiting to rid his people of the invaders. Those invaders were now the Normans themselves, and so they invented new myths, shaped the old tales to their advantage. Celtic warriors became chivalrous Norman knights. Henry would be the new Arthur, but to be so, he would have to bury the old. And so conveniently, very conveniently, the monks of Glastonbury dug up the remains of a giant, Arthur. He was dead after all. If it was God who made the earth, it was man who made its nations. Wales was a nation long before the conquest, but it was always a nation under threat. The danger came from outside and from the disunity inside. King Howell the Good had almost succeeded, but in Wales there was no unbroken dynastic lineage recognized by all. Only in religion was there unity, St. David acknowledged by all as the patron saint, and his cathedral church the centre of Welsh spiritual life. But it was a church governed from Canterbury. In like manner, the Welsh princes knew their place.
If the King of England marched into Wales, there would be no doubt that sooner or later the kings of Wales would have to submit, acknowledge his supremacy, pay him tribute. They had done so under the Anglo-Saxon kings. There was no reason whatsoever why they shouldn't do it again to the Normans. And indeed, William the Conqueror made that abundantly clear. In 1081, 15 years after the conquest of England, he marched through South Wales, allegedly on a pilgrimage, but a pilgrimage with a high political intent, to St. David's. And there he no doubt negotiated, we don't have the details, but he no doubt negotiated with the local ruler, a man called Rhys ap Tewdwr, who agreed to pay what we would call a rent, an annual tribute to him. Sometimes the tribute had been paid in cattle, sometimes in gold. This time it's referred to £40 a year. And that's the kind of loyalty, an acceptance of the superiority of the King of England, which the kings normally required of the Princes of Wales. And they were generally content with that and expected the Kings of Wales, or the Princes of Wales, to toe the line.
But that was never going to be enough for the Norman knights. Soon after Hastings, they came a-knocking at the door of Wales. These were a motley collection of freelance knights, independent provincial families of the parent mafia that had conquered England. Yet for all that, they were Normans. Ever greedy for new lands, especially good new lands, and utterly determined to achieve their objectives. People to be feared.
The Normans appear very often as the scourge of God. They're out there fighting the infidel, punishing people who break their oaths, somehow being the Pope's right-hand men. But they're also the archetypal hero figure. They are bigger than life. They have eyes that shoot fire. They are somehow above the law in the way that all archetypal heroes are. James Bond or whoever you like to mention, they may be doing good in a way, but they're also above the laws which sort of bind normal people. And they enjoy, in a way, or they're presented as enjoying acts of extraordinary ruthlessness and cruelty. Their own chroniclers like presenting them as glorified thugs. And that's how both their own people and outsiders see them. They glory, really, in this sort of sense of themselves as an indomitable people whom nobody and nothing can stop. And their chroniclers very much describe them as people who need to be tamed, who've got to be kept in check, because you never quite know what a Norman may do to you. A Norman is not somebody you want to meet in an alley on a dark night.
Neither was he someone you wanted to meet on the Welsh border in broad daylight. This was a war machine no Welshman had ever faced the like of before. Their armaments, state-of-the-art implements of war. The leaders all worked under license from the nearest baron or lord, but in essence, they were nothing more than bandit thugs who simply took what lands they wanted. Their cavalry and their well-armed foot soldiers wrought havoc amongst those Welshmen who plucked up enough courage to offer resistance. Wales lay wide open to their attacks.
The Normans did not think of territorial expansion, I think, in country terms. They took land wherever they found it. And they wouldn't say, oh, should we have land in England? They would take land if they managed to get hold of it. So they would expand anywhere, into Sicily, in South Italy, into Scotland, into Wales, into Ireland, into England. And they saw no inconsistency in this. For them, it was wealth. And if they could exploit it effectively, it added, as it were, it was like a multinational company. They're building up assets in different parts of their empire.
That empire now included large swathes of Wales. Still hopelessly disunited and poorly armed, while the Welsh argued amongst themselves, so the Norman bandits helped themselves to their lands. Then would come the Motte and Bailey Castle, quickly converted in key places to stone keeps and imposing castles. Chepstow, in the southeast corner of the country, is a perfect example. The shock tactics of invasion having been expended, it was soon necessary to build a lasting presence. Force of numbers alone demanded it. Their imposing nature served to warn all to know their place. They needed to be strong. This was frontier country, the peculiar Welsh march.
It was neither of pure Wales, nor was it of England. And it's an in-between kind of world. And it's in-between in the sense that it is, at one level, neither Welsh nor English. Not part of any Welsh polity, nor of an English polity, but it's also in between. It's clearly it's an area where cultures and peoples and economies meet. So it's a very hybrid zone.
And its existence has persisted down to the present. Beyond it, Welsh Wales. It retained much of its independence at first, but this was constantly being eroded, until in the end, with the Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284, Wales finally buckled. It was now a conquered nation. The towering castles built by the English became centres around which Englishness flourished and Welshness all but perished. Today, they are the magnificent badges of a nation's subjection. Since it is men who make nations, it is only men who live there that can destroy them. The Welsh never did destroy Wales. The sense of being a nation survived. The main would-be destroyer of Wales was the French-speaking English king, Edward I. He gained even greater notoriety as the Hammer of the Scots. Medieval Scotland was an ethnically disunited kingdom. Behind its constantly shifting border lived a mixture of Picts, Gaels, Britons, Norsemen, and Anglo-Saxons. And yet, nurtured by its monarchy, a sense of national unity was emerging. Edinburgh is now the capital city and seat of the Scottish nation's devolved government. It has not always been so, and was only established a capital in the 15th century. Today, a somewhat comical scene is reenacted on the castle battlements. How the British, Scots included, revel in military pageantry. It all reinforces a country's myth. In the castle precincts are further reminders. The ancient list of its leaders and its kings, with pride of place going to Kenneth MacAlpin. It was widely agreed that from the 9th century, he was the starting point in the genealogy of Scottish kings. In this respect, Scotland had something that Wales did not, an unbroken royal line. He was first inaugurated king here at Scone, and a powerful tradition was born. Later, kings would extend their hold over more and more of the country. By the time of the Normans then, what was the stature of the Royal House of Scotland?
Oh, I'm sure that if you asked the King of Scotland, he would have said, I'm a full member of the Royal Club of Europe. In a way, though, I think if you look at the marriages of the kings of the Scots, you can see they're not really quite on a par with the King of England or the King of Germany, the King of France, certainly not. But they are becoming it. In the 13th century, for the first time, you get a King of the Scots who marries the legitimate daughter of another king. Before then, you look at the wives of the kings of Scots, and really they are marrying either aristocratic girls, but not royal girls, or if they are daughters of kings, they're bastard daughters.
The Normans invaded Wales. Scotland invited them in. The first to do so was Macbeth, in reality a very different king from the one concocted by Shakespeare. Scotland's royal house was acutely aware that to prevent the country becoming a backwater, then intercourse with the south had to be encouraged. Under the aegis of its royal house, Latin religious orders were introduced. Melrose was the first Cistercian house in Scotland. Others would follow. To the dismay of the local clergy, the religious practices of the Latin Church were imposed, including, alas, celibacy. Yet, despite all their efforts, the Royal House of Scotland remained one step behind their English counterparts.
The King of England was absolutely clear that ultimately he was superior, and indeed would even claim, when it came to the crunch, that he had what he called a superior lordship over Scotland, that this was a second division king and he was a Premier League king. But the other thing that he did, very deliberately as it were, to remind the Scottish king of his inferior position, was to prevent the attempts that the Scottish kings made to increase the prestige of their monarchy by getting two crucial elements added to the inauguration ceremony. One was the ceremony of anointing with the holy oil, making the king almost a priest, and the other was the ceremony of coronation. Both of them would have enhanced the prestige and standing of the Scottish monarchy, but they needed to be secured permission from the Pope for those ceremonies to happen, and the King of England frustrated them every time in the attempt to secure that.
Eventually, full kingship would be achieved, and a Scotsman would wear the crown. It was a crown he had to fight for, against the same Edward I and then his son. He is now a legend, his history woven into the myths of the nation. His ancestral name was Robert Huit de Bruce, 8th in direct line from a baron who in 1066 had supported William the Conqueror. Ireland, the third Celtic nation to feel the force of the Normans. It had never been conquered in its entire history, except, that is, by the new religion preached by St. Patrick. Its political life still rooted in the old prehistoric ways. At the Hill of Tara, the High King was elected. There was no unbroken dynasty. Religion has so often dominated Irish politics, and so it did again. Here, they say, under the high altar at St. Peter's in Rome, are the remains of the apostle himself, the rock on which this church was founded. Here, too, the tomb of the only English pope, Hadrian IV. Heavily dependent on the Normans, he had already rewarded William with sovereignty over southern Italy and the kingship of Sicily. He now extended his favours to the Normans of the north, granting Henry II the right to incorporate Ireland into his realm. There was more to this than just currying favour with the Normans. Hadrian was a reforming pope and had heard terrible reports about the church in Ireland. The Irish were not men, but beasts, wallowing in vice, said one account. The permissiveness of Irish social and sexual customs and the largely tribal church organisation were deeply shocking to Hadrian. Henry II, he reckoned, would reform all this. It took Henry 15 years to take up the Pope's favours. The start of it all may be focused on Leinster, where people had united to rid themselves of their tyrant king Dermot MacMurrough. He in turn sought Henry II's help to restore his kingdom. Meanwhile, across the Irish Sea in Pembroke Castle, biding his time, was another reprobate, the Norman baron commonly known as Strongbow. All that Dermot got in his appeals to Henry was a sheaf of letters saying that any assistance given to the said Dermot would not be viewed with disfavour by the king. One of them landed here in Pembroke, and Strongbow saw his chance. A deal was struck. If Strongbow and his knights would help Dermot recover his kingdom, he would be given his daughter in marriage and be sole heir to the kingdom. When the advance guard of Strongbow's army arrived, they weathered the Irish attack by driving a herd of cattle into the advancing warriors. Ireland, its historians recalled, was lost on that day. Dermot was called to fulfill his side of the bargain, and his daughter and Strongbow were duly married on the battlefield. This place, Canterbury, is what bothered Henry. Irish affairs paled to insignificance compared to this place and its troublesome archbishop. This was an archbishop Henry had appointed, an old-time pal, his one-time chancellor, Thomas a Becket. He was now a veritable pain. What had happened to bring such a change in the man?
Becket is, of course, a very intriguing character, and nobody's ever quite going to know what makes him tick. I don't think that he has a religious conversion. I think he is, as has sometimes been suggested, the kind of guy who wants to do whatever job it is to the best of his ability. I think he knows when he becomes Archbishop that he's really out of his depth. He's not a monk, as the previous Archbishops of Canterbury have been. He has big rivals, notably Gilbert Folliot, who says this guy's a fool and always has been. At the beginning of his period of office, he actually let down his bench of bishops twice. And I think after that, he thinks, I'm not going to do that again. And I think that determination not to yield turns into a frightening kind of obstinacy which makes any negotiation with Henry II very, very difficult.
Henry II's tussle with Becket was fueled by their rivalry over control of the Church of England. It's questionable that when Henry uttered those infamous words, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" that he meant them to be taken literally. But they were. And Becket knew they would be. They came in on cue, his murderers, the first with a slash of his sword sliced into his head. The second struck a blow so hard that his sword broke in two on hitting the stone floor. To finish the job, the third plunged his sword into Becket's head, scooped out his brains and splattered them on the cathedral floor. To Becket came the martyr's crown. But what of Henry?
I think the immediate effect of it was to unnerve him. He didn't know what to do. He was worried. It was clear that the King of France and the Pope and all the people he was used to dealing with were furious, unlikely to do anything. And so really, as soon as he saw danger from them coming, he did a bunk. He went off to Ireland.
It was the first time an English king had been here. Worried by tales of Strongbow's success, he arrived with a huge army. No fighting was necessary. The Irish king and bishops submitted voluntarily. And so the island was quickly dotted with the usual Norman castles, although Irish historians have no illusions. They call them English castles. As for Strongbow, newly come into his kingdom, he knew on which side his bread was buttered and gratefully accepted Leinster in fief. Here he was buried, cross-legged in full Norman armour, the first man to invade Ireland. In turn, other lands were freely distributed amongst Henry's knights. Around the castles they built were built also islands of a different language and culture. In too came the Latin monks. Hadrian, now long dead, would have been delighted to see their monasteries spreading at a record pace throughout the land. Although purged of corruption and worldliness, these were working monks. Not just given to prayer and contemplation, they opened up new lands, cleared the bogs, cleared the forests. Soon, in Ireland as in the rest of Britain, they became powerhouses of economic growth. Theirs was part of the new way. Ireland was being transformed, but to Henry, this mattered little.
He really didn't want to be bothered, I think, very much with Wales and Ireland and Scotland. Those were barbarous lands as far as he was concerned, where people made trouble, life was a bit primitive. Leave what he would have thought as a 12th century Celtic fringe to itself.
Still, there were plenty of adventurers and expansionists ready to cross the Irish Sea to seek their fortune. To the Irish, these newcomers, despite their Norman names and titles, despite even their French language, they were English. This was an English conquest.
And what is interesting about Ireland, as of Wales, but not of Scotland, is that these English settlers, on the whole, preserved their English identity. They did not merge into the local population. They defensively regarded themselves as English, used English law, tried to keep the English language, English customs, called themselves English, and to that extent drew, as it were, a line between themselves and the Irish.
In popular parlance, this line became the Pale. Because of it, the country suffered a split personality. No Englishman wanted to become Irish, but there were plenty of Irish who wanted to become English. Ireland's unique independence was over. It's never been fully regained since. The Abbey of Fontevraud was the subject of a letter sent many centuries later by none other than Queen Victoria to the prefect of this area in the Loire Valley. It requested that all the bodies in one of the family tombs in the abbey be exhumed and dispatched to London. The prefect thought long and hard, but declined her request. According to his view of history, they were French citizens who had long returned home, and here they were to stay. At the head of the group, the King of England, Henry II, who had inherited and built an empire. Alongside him, his queen, Eleanor. She had borne him 5 male heirs. Only 2 survived him. The one was the unbelievably good prince of chivalry, Richard the Lionheart. The other, his father's favourite, to whom he granted Ireland, the unbelievably bad John. For the first 20 years of marriage, Henry and Eleanor had shared an energetic partnership in government and in bed. She was then cast aside in both. As her husband took on a string of mistresses, she was left with memories. Yet she resolutely refused to passively accept the situation. She was never one to contemplate that which would not return. Her beauty may have waned, her intellect hadn't. And so she meticulously worked out a method to topple her husband. Henry's weakness was their sons. Their father, she persuaded them, was robbing them of their rightful power, demeaning their dignity. In 1189, Eleanor's favourite, Richard, rose to the bait. He declared war on his father, won it, and submitted Henry to make a humble peace with him. Within 2 days, Henry had died of a broken heart. Richard was free to pursue his own ways, and within days of his sumptuous coronation, disappeared to the Holy Land and the Crusade. With Richard away, John, acting on his behalf, took more than a fancy to the affairs of state. When Richard was captured on return from the Holy Land, John duly declared him dead and himself king. The expense of Richard's campaigns was costing England dear in many ways. It would be 2 years before Richard was eventually released to freedom. 2 years of concern in England and of grief to his mother. Settling in his castle on the Seine, the Chateau Guillard, literally the saucy castle, he concentrated on controlling Normandy. He spent little time in the England that had brought his release. The ransom set on Richard's head had been enormous. Eleanor called in all the political favours she could help to pay it. It cost England 34 tons of gold. The kingdom was close to bankruptcy. Then a further act of foolish bravado in France brought about his death. A chance arrow caught him in the neck, and the wound turned gangrenous. His heart was carefully removed and brought for burial here, Rouen Cathedral. It's what he would have wanted, for Rouen was far more a capital to him than London. In an age much given to parcelling up various parts of the anatomy of the deceased, it is only Richard's heart that lies in Rouen, alongside an effigy of his queen. Their bodies are at Fontevraud, located at the feet of their parents. It's odd how the English still revere him, for in life, England to him was nothing but a credit bank. His brother John was at last the rightful king. Opposing him across the Channel, one of the best French kings ever, Philip Augustus. Dangerous times lay ahead. The growth in power of successive kings of England since 1066 had caused a growing resentment among the royal house of the Capets in France. Now the Capetians fought back, starting with a deliberate and highly successful PR exercise. Their churches were filled with grandeur, reminding all of the divine rights of the King of France. French history was commandeered in the campaign on a grand scale. The King of England may have a great deal of land in France, but it is the King of France who has ultimate sovereignty over it, and sovereignty is given by God. As usual, in the creation of national myths, it was necessary to bend the truth a little, as the Capetians highlighted their ancestral links to Charlemagne. If people want to believe something enough, then they will believe it. Philip's strategy began to bear fruit. The King of France, the people believed, was a semi-divine figure, blessed as a king, not in battles, but by the Lord Almighty. Though blessed now with the kingdom, John, alas, was not blessed with any skills in its governance. He had an innate knack of making enemies. He was at loggerheads with the Pope. His own barons, both sides of the Channel, distrusted him. Even his own mother distrusted him. Eventually, the animosity between himself and Philip turned to war. The opposing forces clashed on the plain of Bouvines in northern France. For the English, the date 1214 carries none of the resonance of 1066. For the French, it is the date of their great national victory. In a fatal encounter, England lost Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Brittany, and Normandy. It was a battle of staggering significance both for the English and the French.
Once these lands have been conquered by the kings of France and added to his lands, you have to choose. You can't have lands in Normandy and in England. You've had them hitherto without any problem whatsoever of conflict loyalty, because the same man was Duke of Normandy and King of England. But now the man who's Duke of Normandy is King of France. Are you going to retain your lands in Normandy, in which case you have to be loyal to the King of France, and forfeit your lands in England? Or vice versa, if your major estate is in England, are you going to abandon, in effect, your land in Normandy and stay English? And that is crucial in the formation of English political identity. It means now that England closes in on itself and increasingly becomes a country which is obsessed with its identity as a single country. It has been part of much larger feudal empires, Norman or Angevin. Now it is England. The king lives in England. He had not lived in England for any great length of the time before. His aristocracy is now resident in England and there all the time. So it's really a remarkable turn-up for the books. The people who had been proud of being Normans, of not being English, have now become English. They've had to sort out, as it were, their geographical and national identities. And England becomes, in that respect, at one level at least, a truly xenophobic country, again in the 13th century. Having lived under Norman rule, being part of an international Europe, it begins to become an insular country once more.
And so, many would argue, it has remained. The Channel is a boundary indeed, beyond which only foreigners live. For John, defeat abroad would spawn rebellion at home. Throughout his reign, he had treated his barons with a contempt they had not deserved. The huge losses in France meant that he would now be forced to yield to their demands. Demands summed up in one of medieval Europe's best-known documents. Magna Carta. It's been labelled the birth certificate of the Constitution. Its 63 articles, in fact, are full of baronial bellyaches. Included too are calls for a ban on trials without witnesses, condemnation of the arrest of freemen saved by the judgment of their peers, and the demands that the king too should obey the law. Magna Carta marked the end of an era. An era that started in Europe with a new millennium of comparative peace from plundering raids from the pagan north and barbarian advances from the east. The Christian church, so long the cesspit of sleaze and corruption, was slowly being reformed. Agriculture was improving, new lands brought into cultivation, populations rising, economies, and moneyed ones at that, thriving. It was into this Europe that the Normans had imposed their story. A remarkable story, preserved in part through its glorious buildings. They remain awe-inspiring. Many of the monasteries have not fared well over the years, yet they are still reminders of the glories of their times. Once spiritual centres that were also in Europe the only centres of learning. And powerhouses of economic growth. Other ruins are reminders of war, of loss of lands, of loss of national independence, of loss of blood. Everything in the Norman story underscores the huge changes in a continent's history.
The success of the Normans coincides in point of time with what has been called the ascent of Europe. Europe takes off from being a beleaguered, defensive, uncertain little continent, literally thinking itself possibly on the edge of extinction. It gradually goes on the offensive. It's to be witnessed in the Crusades, in the expansion of the Normans, in a certain new confidence in Europe, in the economic takeoff, in the growth of population, all sorts of facets, which have been called literally the making of Europe. Europe becomes to believe in itself and to have common norms. It also, at a certain level, believes that it is now the world standard bearer. And it is, I think, no coincidence that the Norman expansion happens in point of time to coincide with this European takeoff. They are, as it were, two sides of the same coin.
In Worcester Cathedral, a king lies buried. He is the infamous King John, the first English king since 1066 to be born and to die in England. He died in all things but language, an English king. It was not until 1801 that the English monarchy finally relinquished its claim to the French throne. Yet in reality, John's descendants put the demands of their English kingdom first. The Normans now disappeared from the history of the four nations of the Isles.